The screaming started before dawn, echoing through the transport bay like the death cries of some massive beast. But it wasn't a beast. It was Grox 9, and he was hungry again. I watched through the reinforced viewing port as the huge creature slammed his fists against the containment cell walls, each blow sending tremors through the deck plating beneath my feet. Blood ran down his knuckles where he'd scraped them raw against the adamantium barriers, but he didn't seem to notice. Ograns don't feel pain the way normal humans do. They feel everything else too much, but pain barely registers until their bones are showing through their skin. "Another feeding cycle," muttered Commissar Vex, adjusting the grip on his bolt pistol. "Third one this rotation. At this rate, we'll run out of protein paste before we reach the combat zone." I nodded but didn't speak. What was there to say? Grox 9 wasn't just hungry for food. He was hungry for everything he'd lost when they dragged him from whatever miserable world had birthed him and stuffed him into the uniform of the Astra Militarum. Hungry for home. Hungry for understanding. Hungry for a life that made sense. But Ograns don't get those things. They get las rifles too small for their massive hands and orders too complex for their simple minds, and officers who see them as nothing more than walking battering rams wrapped in human flesh. My name is Medici Primus Jorek Thane, and I've spent the last 15 years treating the Imperium's expendable soldiers. I've seen las burn victims whose flesh had been cooked to the consistency of over-roasted Grox meat. I've held the hands of dying guardsmen while they whispered final messages to families they'd never see again. I've sewn limbs back onto bodies and pumped chemical stimulants into hearts that had given up the will to beat. But nothing in my medical training had prepared me for working with Ograns. They call them abhumans, a polite term that acknowledges their basic humanity while making it clear they're something less than the rest of us. Genetic deviants whose ancestors were changed by millennia of exposure to hostile environments, toxic chemicals, or simply the random cruelty of evolution in a galaxy that cares nothing for the weak. The Imperium tolerates them because they're useful. A single Augran can carry equipment that would require a full squad of regular guardsmen to lift. They can punch through armor that would stop a last blast and keep fighting with injuries that would kill normal humans. They're fearless in combat, not because they're brave, but because they lack the intelligence to fully comprehend the dangers they face. But usefulness doesn't make them human, not in the eyes of the officers who command them or the soldiers who fight beside them. They're tools, living weapons pointed at the Imperium's enemies and expected to keep firing until they break. I learned this truth during my first assignment to the 127th Cadian Heavy Infantry. The regiment had been reinforced with 2 full companies of Augran auxiliaries, and High Command decided they needed a medical officer with experience in abhuman physiology. My previous posting had involved treating rattling snipers whose enhanced metabolisms required specialized medication protocols, so they considered me qualified. The Ograns were housed in the lower cargo decks of our transport vessel, packed into reinforced compartments that had originally been designed for storing volatile ammunition. The space was cramped even by Imperial Guard standards, with barely enough room for the massive soldiers to lie down fully extended. The air recycling systems struggled to handle their elevated body heat and oxygen consumption, leaving the atmosphere thick and humid. When I first descended into those depths, the smell hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just unwashed bodies and poor ventilation. There was something else beneath it, something that spoke of desperation and confusion, and a kind of loneliness so complete that it had become a physical presence. The Ograns were sitting in rows along the walls of their compartment, their massive frames squeezed together like children in adult furniture. Some of them were trying to maintain their equipment, holding las rifles that looked like toys in their enormous hands. Others stared at the walls with blank expressions, their minds retreating into whatever private spaces offered refuge from their circumstances. Grox 9 was in the center of the group, and even among his fellow giants he stood out. Where most Ograns topped out around 8 feet in height, he was closer to 9.5. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn sideways to fit through standard Imperial doorways, and his hands could wrap completely around a normal human's torso. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Most Ogrins have a vacant quality to their gaze, an emptiness that speaks to their limited cognitive capacity. Grox 9's eyes held something different, not intelligence exactly, but awareness, as if somewhere behind that massive skull, something was paying attention in ways that made the commissars nervous. "You the new bone mender?" His voice was like boulders grinding together, each word forced through vocal cords that seemed designed for roaring rather than conversation. "I'm Medici Thane," I replied, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at me to maintain distance. "I'm here to conduct medical evaluations of your unit." He laughed, and the sound echoed through the compartment like artillery fire. "Evaluations. That means you're gonna poke and prod and write numbers on data slates about how we ain't quite human enough for the fancy quarters upstairs." The other Ogrins shifted restlessly at his words. I could feel their attention focusing on our conversation, dozens of massive forms leaning forward to catch every word. The tension in the air thickened, and I became acutely aware of how isolated I was down here, surrounded by beings who could tear me apart without breaking stride. "The evaluations are for your benefit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "To ensure you receive proper medical care and to identify any issues that might affect your combat effectiveness." "Combat effectiveness." Grox 9 repeated the words slowly as if tasting them. "That's all we are to you little people, ain't it? How good we kill things for the Emperor." Before I could respond, he stood up, and suddenly I understood why the compartment ceiling was reinforced. His head nearly touched the overhead beams, and his presence filled the space so completely that it felt like standing in the shadow of a mountain. "You want to evaluate us, Bone Mender? Then you better understand what you're looking at. We ain't just big humans. We ain't just stupid humans. We're something else entirely, and most of the time we don't even know what that means." He gestured toward his companions, his massive arms sweeping across the cramped space. "Look at them. Really look. See how they hold themselves? See how they watch the walls like they're expecting them to close in? That ain't just because the quarters are small. That's because every one of us remembers something else. Something from before." I followed his gaze, studying the other Ogrins with new attention. Now that he'd pointed it out, I could see what he meant. There was a quality to their posture that spoke of spaces larger than any starship corridor, of skies wider than the narrow viewports that provided their only glimpse of the void outside. "Where are you from?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Medical evaluations didn't typically include discussions of personal history. "Corva Prime," Grox 9 replied, settling back down onto the bench that groaned under his weight. "Mining world in the Segmentum Ultima. Gravity 3 times Terra Standard, atmosphere thick enough to choke a normal human, surface temperature that'll freeze your spit before it hits the ground." He paused, his eyes focusing on something I couldn't see. But it was home. Had crystal caves that went down so deep you could walk for days and never see the same formation twice. Underground rivers that sang when the wind caught them right. Fields of ice flowers that bloomed once every 7 years and turned the whole landscape purple for a few precious weeks. The other Ogrins were nodding now, and I realized they were remembering their own homes. Worlds scattered across the galaxy, each one unique in its harshness, each one producing its own variant of abhuman adaptation. "The recruiters came when I was 43 standard years old," Grox 9 continued. "Told us the Imperium had need of strong backs and willing hearts. Said we'd serve the Emperor and bring honor to our clans. Made it sound like a grand adventure." His laugh was bitter now, lacking any trace of humor. "They didn't mention we'd be leaving everything behind forever. Didn't mention that once you put on the uniform, you stop being Corvin and become just another Augran. Didn't mention that most of the people you'll serve with will look at you like you're some kind of trained animal. I found myself thinking of my own recruitment into the Medicae Corps, the ceremony at the academy, the pride on my family's faces, the sense of purpose that had carried me through years of difficult training. Had it been the same for these giants? Had they once felt the same calling to serve something greater than themselves? "How long have you been in service?" I asked. 12 years, 4 months, 16 days, he replied without hesitation. "And before you ask, yeah, I remember exactly, we all do. Ogrins might not be smart by your standards, but we remember things that matter. Every battle, every world, every brother we've lost." He gestured toward an empty section of bench. Grok 7 used to sit there, lost him on Vandalis when a dark Eldar splinter cannon took his head clean off. Grox 2 was next to him, stepped on a landmine during the assault on Hive Terminus. Grox 5 made it all the way to the extraction point before he bled out from wounds he was too tough to notice during the fighting. The catalog of losses continued, each name accompanied by details of how they died. I realized that Grox 9 wasn't just recounting casualties, he was preserving their memory in the only way available to him. These massive soldiers had no families to mourn them, no homeworlds to record their sacrifice, only their surviving comrades to remember that they had existed at all. "The worst part," Grox 9 said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than his normal tone, "is that we know we're expendable. Command doesn't try to hide it. Send the Ogrins first, they say. If there's a minefield, march them through it. If there's a fortress that needs storming, point them at the gates and tell them to run." He looked directly at me and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach clench with guilt. "You want to know what it's like being an Augran in the Imperium, Bone Mender? It's like being a weapon that knows it's going to break. Question is just when and how much damage you can do before it happens." The medical evaluation took 3 days, and every hour of it challenged assumptions I'd held about abhuman psychology and physiology. The Ogrins were indeed different from baseline humans, but the differences went far beyond simple size and strength. Their bone density was nearly 50% higher than normal, their muscle fiber structure optimized for sustained heavy labor. Their cardiovascular systems operated at pressures that would cause fatal strokes in unaugmented humans. Most fascinating of all, their neural architecture showed evidence of adaptations that enhanced certain types of memory while limiting others. They could remember tactical information with perfect clarity, troop movements, weapon specifications, the exact layout of battlefields they'd fought on years earlier. But abstract concepts, mathematical relationships, and logical reasoning remained frustratingly beyond their grasp. It was as if their brains had been specialized for war at the genetic level, optimized to absorb and retain the kind of information that would keep them alive in combat while discarding everything else as unnecessary luxury. "Is it true that Ogrins can't feel fear?" I asked Grox 9 during one of our sessions. He was sitting on a reinforced examination table, allowing me to check the mobility of his shoulder joints. The range of motion was impressive. Despite his massive frame, he retained the flexibility needed for close-quarters combat. "That's what the commissars tell the regular troops," he replied. "Makes them feel better about sending us into situations where normal humans would break and run. But it ain't true. We feel fear just fine. We just don't understand it the same way you do." He flexed his arm, the motion causing muscles the size of my torso to shift beneath his skin. "When a normal human gets scared, they start thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Their minds race through possibilities, calculating odds, looking for ways to avoid danger. Our minds don't work that way. We see the threat, we feel the fear, but we don't have the mental machinery to do anything with it except push forward." The explanation was more sophisticated than I'd expected from someone classified as mentally deficient. You seem to understand complex ideas better than your psychological profile suggests. That's because the profile is based on tests designed for little people, Grox9 said, using the Augran term for normal humans. Ask me to do math or read technical manuals, and yeah, I'll fail every time. But ask me about tactics, about reading terrain, about understanding how different weapons work in different situations, and I'll surprise you. He tapped the side of his head with one massive finger. We ain't stupid, Bone Mender. We're specialized, just like a chainsword is specialized for cutting and a melt-a-gun is specialized for burning through armor. We're specialized for war. The insight was disturbing because it suggested a level of self-awareness that the Imperial classification system didn't account for. If Ograns understood their role as living weapons, if they were conscious of their expendability, then their continued service represented something more complex than simple-minded obedience. Why do you keep fighting? I asked. If you know how the Imperium sees you, if you understand that you're considered expendable, why not refuse orders? Why not rebel? Grox9 was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focusing on the distant bulkhead as if he could see through the metal to the stars beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the medical bay. Because the alternative is worse. You think the universe cares about fair treatment or dignity or any of the things you little people worry about? Out there in the dark, there's things that would eat us all, Augran and human alike, without bothering to tell the difference. He stood up, his massive frame making the reinforced table groan in relief. The Imperium ain't perfect. Hell, most of the time it ain't even good. But it's the only thing standing between us and complete darkness. And if keeping that barrier intact means accepting that we're tools instead of people, then that's a price worth paying. The conversation stayed with me for days afterward. I'd expected to find simple-minded brutes driven by basic needs and primitive loyalty. Instead, I'd discovered soldiers who understood their place in the cosmic order with a clarity that put most of their human officers to shame. But understanding didn't make their circumstances any less horrific. The transport reached its destination 6 weeks later. Mortis Gamma, a fortress world that had fallen to chaos 3 months earlier. Intelligence indicated that the enemy forces were dug in deep, using the planet's extensive tunnel networks to avoid orbital bombardment while maintaining supply lines to their forward positions. High Command's solution was elegantly brutal. Send the Ograns into the tunnels where their size and strength would be advantages rather than hindrances. Let them clear out the underground positions while regular Imperial forces secured the surface installations. It was a suicide mission disguised as tactical deployment, and everyone involved knew it. I watched from the medical bay's observation deck as the Augran auxiliaries prepared for deployment. They moved with the practiced efficiency of seasoned soldiers, checking their equipment and reviewing their orders with the same attention to detail I'd seen in elite human units. But there was something else in their movements, a quality I'd learned to recognize during my time with them. They were saying goodbye, not to each other. Ograns weren't demonstrative about emotional farewells. They were saying goodbye to the concept of survival, accepting their role as expendable assets in a war machine that measured success in objectives achieved rather than lives preserved. Grox9 found me before the final deployment briefing. He'd squeezed his massive frame through the medical bay's access hatch, a feat that should have been impossible given the dimensional constraints of the opening. Came to settle accounts, Bone Mender, he said, settling onto the floor since none of the furniture could support his weight. Been thinking about our talks, and there's something I need to tell you. I waited, recognizing the deliberate pace that marked Augran communication when they were wrestling with complex ideas. You asked me why we keep fighting. Why we don't rebel against a system that treats us like weapons. I gave you an answer about cosmic threats and necessary sacrifices, and that was true as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth. He paused, his massive hands working at something I couldn't see. When he opened them, I saw a small piece of crystal that caught the light like captured starfire. "This is from the deep caves of Corva Prime. Took me 3 days to find it and another week to dig it out of the rock. Carried it with me through 12 years of service because it reminds me of something I want you to understand." He held the crystal up to the light and patterns of color danced across the walls of the medical bay. "Beauty exists in this universe, Bone Mender. Wonder exists. Things worth protecting that have nothing to do with strategy or resource allocation or any of the calculations that drive Imperial policy." The crystal disappeared back into his massive palm. "We fight because someone has to. Not because the commissars order it or because the Emperor demands it, but because if we don't, all the beautiful things in all the hidden places on all the forgotten worlds will disappear forever." He stood up, his head nearly touching the ceiling. "The Imperium sees us as weapons, and maybe that's all we can ever be in their eyes. But weapons can choose their targets. And we've chosen to aim ourselves at the darkness that would swallow everything we've ever loved." The crystal reappeared in his hand, and he placed it carefully on my desk. "Take this back to Terra when your service is done. Find some museum or archive or forgotten corner where it can remind someone that Corva Prime existed, that we existed, that for a few brief moments in cosmic time there were giants who remembered home." He turned to leave, then paused at the access hatch. "One more thing, Bone Mender. When the reports come back from Mortis Gamma, when the casualty lists show that most of us didn't make it out of those tunnels, remember that we knew what we were walking into. Remember that we chose it anyway. Remember that dying like weapons doesn't mean we lived like weapons." The assault on Mortis Gamma lasted 18 hours. The Augran auxiliaries penetrated deep into the tunnel networks, engaging chaos cultists in close quarters fighting that would have been impossible for regular human forces. Their progress was marked by the steady stream of position reports that flowed back to the command center, each transmission confirming another section cleared, another objective secured. Then the communications stopped. Reconnaissance drones sent into the tunnels found evidence of massive battles fought in spaces too cramped for normal tactics. Walls were scarred by lasfire and chainsword cuts. Entire sections had been brought down by explosions or the sheer kinetic force of giants fighting hand-to-hand combat against enemies that refused to yield. Bodies were scattered through the deeper passages. Chaos cultists mostly, their twisted forms bearing the marks of violence delivered by hands strong enough to crush skulls and tear limbs from sockets. But scattered among them were the remains of Imperial auxiliaries, their massive frames finally brought low by accumulated damage that even their enhanced physiology couldn't overcome. The final casualty report listed 87 Augran auxiliaries killed in action, with another 12 so severely wounded that they were classified as combat ineffective. Of the entire force that had descended into the tunnels, only 6 emerged in condition to continue fighting. Grox 9 was not among them. Search teams found his body 3 kilometers underground, in a chamber that had been carved out of living rock by some ancient civilization. He'd made his final stand there, surrounded by the bodies of 17 chaos cultists, whose mutations spoke of decades spent in service to the dark gods. His chainsword was still clutched in his right hand, its blessed blade broken near the hilt from overuse. His last rifle lay nearby, its power pack exhausted and its barrel warped by heat damage, but it was his left hand that caught my attention when I reviewed the reconnaissance footage. It was closed around something small, something that the search team had initially overlooked. When they finally pried his fingers open, they found fragments of crystal that sparkled like captured starfire even in the harsh glare of their portable illuminators. He'd carried a piece of home with him into the darkness. In his final moments, as the enemies of mankind closed in around him, he'd held on to something that reminded him of beauty and wonder and the vast spaces beneath Corva Prime's frozen surface. The official report classified the tunnel assault as a tactical success. Objectives had been secured, enemy positions neutralized, and the surface assault could proceed with minimal resistance. The Augran auxiliaries had performed their function exactly as planned, absorbing casualties that would have decimated human units while achieving mission parameters within acceptable timeframes. But success is measured differently depending on where you stand in the Imperial hierarchy. From the perspective of High Command, 87 dead Ograns represented an acceptable loss rate for the strategic advantages gained. Abhuman auxiliaries were replaceable resources, their value calculated in terms of training investment versus combat effectiveness. New units could be recruited from the same worlds that had produced the current generation, and the cycle would continue. From the perspective of the surviving Ograns, the losses represented something else entirely. These weren't just casualties, they were brothers, comrades who had shared the unique burden of existing between human and weapon in the Emperor's service. Their deaths left holes in the unit structure that couldn't be filled by simple replacement of personnel. I learned this during my post-action medical evaluations of the survivors. The 6 Ograns who emerged from the tunnels were physically intact but psychologically devastated in ways that standard Imperial doctrine didn't recognize. They'd lost more than comrades. They'd lost the social structure that made their military service bearable. Ograns, I discovered, formed bonds of loyalty that went beyond mere unit cohesion. They were tribal creatures at their core, their enhanced size and strength balanced by an emotional vulnerability that required the support of their pack to function effectively. Remove too many members of that pack, and the survivors would begin to exhibit behavioral patterns that resembled clinical depression in humans. They'd lose interest in maintenance tasks, respond slowly to orders, and show decreased performance in combat situations. But the Imperial military had no protocols for dealing with traumatized Ograns. The assumption was that their limited intelligence made them immune to the psychological effects of combat stress. They were expected to absorb fresh replacements and continue functioning as if nothing had changed. The replacements arrived 2 weeks later. 23 Ograns from various recruitment centers throughout the sector. They were younger than the veterans, their equipment still bearing the crisp edges of recent manufacture, their eyes still holding traces of hope that service to the Emperor would provide meaning and purpose. The survivors welcomed them with the patient courtesy that Ograns showed to all newcomers, teaching them the routines and protocols that governed military life. But there was a distance in their interactions, a guardedness that spoke of emotional wounds too deep for easy healing. I tried to address the issue through standard counseling procedures, but quickly discovered that Ograns processed trauma differently than humans. They didn't respond to talk therapy or pharmaceutical interventions designed for baseline psychology. Instead, they seemed to internalize their losses, carrying the weight of grief like physical burdens that grew heavier with each passing day. The solution, when it came, emerged from the Ograns themselves. I found them one evening in the lower cargo bay, arranged in a circle around a collection of personal items that had belonged to their fallen comrades. Weapons were there, cleaned and maintained despite having no current user. Pictures were there too, crude drawings that showed homeworlds remembered imperfectly but treasured completely. And there were crystals. Dozens of them, each one different, each one carrying the light of some distant star or the memory of some underground cavern where giants had once walked in peace. They were conducting a memorial service, but one unlike anything in Imperial military tradition. There were no prayers to the Emperor, no recitations of battle honors or service records. Instead, they were telling stories. Simple stories, the kind that Ograns could understand and remember. Tales of home and family and moments of beauty that had justified lives lived in service to something greater. Each crystal represented a different story, a different memory preserved against the darkness that threatened to swallow everything they'd fought to protect. "This one belonged to Grox 9, said Grox 14, a veteran whose scars spoke of battles fought on a dozen different worlds. He held up a fragment of starfire crystal, its light dancing across the faces of his comrades. He told me once that when he looked at it, he could hear the song the underground rivers made on Corva Prime when the wind caught them just right. He passed the crystal to the Ogryn beside him, who held it for a moment before adding his own memory. Grox 9 saved my life on Vandelis, dragged me out of a crater when last fire had burned through my armor. Didn't have to do it. Would have been easier to leave me and complete the mission. But he came back anyway because that's what brothers do." The crystal continued its journey around the circle, each Ogryn adding their own remembrance, their own piece of the larger story that gave meaning to their service. By the time it returned to Grox 14, the simple fragment of stone had become something more, a focal point for grief and love and the determination to carry on despite impossible odds. I watched this ritual from the shadows, understanding that I was witnessing something sacred. These giants, dismissed by the Imperium as simple-minded brutes, had created their own response to trauma and loss. They'd found a way to honor their dead that recognized both their humanity and their role as weapons in the Emperor's service. The memorial service became a regular occurrence, held whenever the unit suffered casualties or welcomed new members. It served multiple functions, preserving the memory of the fallen, integrating newcomers into the group dynamic, and maintaining the emotional bonds that made effective combat teamwork possible. But more than that, it represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human psychology and capability. These Ogryns weren't just following orders or responding to instinctive loyalty. They were making conscious choices about how to live and die with dignity in a universe that offered them precious little of either. They were creating culture, preserving history and maintaining traditions that had nothing to do with their military function. They were proving, in their own quiet way, that the line between human and weapon wasn't as clear as Imperial doctrine suggested. My assignment to the 127th Cadian Heavy Infantry lasted another 18 months. During that time, I witnessed 3 more major engagements and participated in the medical care of over 200 Ogryn casualties. Each battle followed the same pattern. The giants would be deployed in the most dangerous situations, expected to absorb casualties that would cripple human units while achieving objectives that regular troops couldn't handle. They'd fight with the desperate courage of beings who understood their expendability, but chose to make their sacrifice meaningful. And after each battle, the survivors would gather in their cargo bay circles, sharing stories and memories that kept the spirits of their fallen comrades alive. I began documenting these rituals in my personal logs, recognizing that I was recording something that had never been officially studied. The Imperial military maintained extensive files on Ogryn physiology and combat effectiveness, but no one had bothered to examine their emotional and social needs. The oversight wasn't accidental. Acknowledging that Ogryns possessed complex inner lives would raise uncomfortable questions about their treatment within the Imperial hierarchy. It was easier to classify them as semi-intelligent tools than to confront the ethical implications of their service. But the evidence of their humanity accumulated with each passing month. I saw Ogryns risk their lives to recover wounded comrades, even when tactical doctrine would have demanded that they abandon the casualties and complete their objectives. I saw them share their rations with newcomers who hadn't yet learned to manage the enhanced caloric requirements of their enhanced metabolism. I saw them maintain equipment that belonged to dead friends, keeping weapons clean and functional in case their spirits might somehow have need of them. Most telling of all, I saw them grieve, Not the simple instinctive sorrow that animals might feel at the loss of pack members, but the complex, layered grief that comes from understanding permanence and injustice, and the terrible randomness of death in wartime. They mourned not just for themselves, but for the families they'd left behind on distant worlds. They worried about sisters and brothers and aging parents who would never know what had happened to the giants who'd marched away to serve the Emperor. They carried guilt for surviving when others had fallen. And they struggled with questions about purpose and meaning that went far beyond their supposed intellectual limitations. These observations led me to a conclusion that would have been considered heretical by the standards of imperial military doctrine. Ograns weren't weapons that happened to be made of flesh and blood. They were people who had been forced into the role of weapons by circumstances beyond their control. The distinction mattered because it changed how their service should be understood and honored. The end of my assignment came suddenly, as military postings often do. New orders arrived via astropathic transmission, directing me to report to a medical facility on Terra for advanced training in battlefield surgery techniques. The transition would be immediate. A transport vessel was already en route to collect me and the other personnel being reassigned. I had 3 days to conclude my work with the 127th and transfer my medical files to my replacement. 3 days to say goodbye to soldiers who had become something more than patients over the months we'd served together. The hardest farewell was with the Augran auxiliaries. They gathered in their usual circle in the cargo bay, but this time the crystals and personal items arranged in the center included contributions from me. My medical kit, no longer needed for their care. A data slate containing copies of the reports I'd written about their service, and a small piece of carved stone I'd purchased from a merchant on our last supply stop. It wasn't much compared to the treasures they'd brought from their homeworlds, but it represented my attempt to contribute something to their memorial tradition, a recognition that their stories deserved to be preserved and honored. "Thank you, Bone Mender," said Grox 14, who had become the informal leader of the unit after so many of the older veterans had fallen. "You saw us as more than weapons. That means something." The other Ograns nodded, their massive forms shifting in the cargo bay lighting. I realized that this might be the last time I'd see them. Their casualty rates made long-term survival unlikely, and my new assignment would take me far from the front lines where they served. "I want you to know," I said, choosing my words carefully, "that serving alongside you has been an honor. Your courage and sacrifice deserve recognition that goes beyond mission reports and casualty statistics." "Recognition would be nice," Grox 14 replied, "but it ain't necessary. We know what we are and why we fight, that's enough." He gestured toward the crystals arranged at the center of their circle. "These tell our real story. Not the official version in the regimental histories, but the truth about what it means to be Augran in the Emperor's service. As long as one of us survives to tell the stories, the others ain't really gone." The transport that carried me away from the 127th departed during the regiment's sleep cycle. I watched through a viewport as the massive ship that had been my home for nearly 2 years dwindled to a point of light against the star field. Somewhere in that vessel's lower decks, giants were sleeping in cramped quarters designed for storing ammunition. Tomorrow they'd wake up and perform their assigned duties with the same patient competence they'd shown every day I'd known them. They'd maintain their equipment and follow their orders and prepare for the next deployment that would ask them to die for objectives they might not fully understand. But they'd also gather in their circles and tell their stories and keep alive the memory of homeworlds that existed beyond the reach of imperial bureaucracy. They'd preserve the humanity that the system tried to take from them, one crystal at a time, one memory at a time, one story at a time. My assignment on Terra lasted 6 months. The advanced surgical training was intensive and valuable, providing me with skills that would serve me well in future postings. But I found myself thinking constantly about the Ograns I'd left behind, wondering how they were faring in whatever battles they'd been sent to fight. The answer came through channels I hadn't expected. A fellow medical officer, recently returned from service in the same sector where the 127th was deployed, brought news that made my chest tighten with grief and pride in equal measure. The regiment had been committed to the defense of Hive World Castellax, where Chaos cultists had seized control of the lower levels and were threatening to spread their corruption throughout the population centers. The Augran auxiliaries had been deployed into the deepest tunnels, tasked with eliminating enemy strongholds that regular troops couldn't reach. It had been a slaughter. Of the 43 Ograns in the unit, only 7 had emerged from the underground fighting. The rest had fallen in battles fought in spaces so cramped that their size became a disadvantage, where their enhanced strength meant little against enemies that attacked with poison gas and explosive traps. But they'd completed their mission. The tunnels had been cleared, the cultist threat neutralized, and the Hive world's population saved from corruption that would have doomed billions of innocent civilians. The survivors, I learned, had requested permission to conduct a memorial service for their fallen comrades. The request had been denied by the unit's new commissar, who considered such rituals a waste of time that could be better spent on combat training. So they'd held the service anyway, in secret, in the depths of their transport vessel where officers rarely ventured. They'd gathered their crystals and their memories and their stories, and they'd honored their dead in the only way they knew how. Word of this unauthorized gathering had reached the commissar, who'd ordered disciplinary action against the participants. 3 of the survivors had been sentenced to punishment detail. 2 had been transferred to penal units. The remaining 2 had simply disappeared from the regimental rolls, their ultimate fate lost in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of imperial military administration. The news hit me like a physical blow. These giants, who had given everything in service to the Imperium, had been punished for the crime of mourning their fallen brothers. Their humanity had been treated as a disciplinary problem rather than something worthy of respect. I tried to learn more about what had happened to the individual survivors, but the trail went cold quickly. Military records showed transfers and reassignments, but tracking abhuman personnel through the imperial bureaucracy was nearly impossible for someone without high-level clearance. They'd vanished into the vast machine of war, their stories scattered to whatever corners of the galaxy their new assignments had taken them. All I had left were my own memories and the reports I'd written during my service with them. But those reports had found their way into official files where they'd been read by people with the authority to act on their recommendations. 6 months after my return to Terra, I received new orders that would change everything I thought I knew about my career in the Imperial military. I was being assigned to the Departamento Munitorum's Medical Research Division, with a specific mandate to study up human psychology and develop improved treatment protocols for non-human Imperial forces. The assignment came with a promotion to senior medicae and access to resources that would allow me to conduct the kind of comprehensive research that had been impossible in field conditions. More importantly, it came with the authority to request specific units for study purposes. I used that authority to track down the survivors from the 127th's Ogryn auxiliaries. It took months of bureaucratic maneuvering and careful application of research protocols, but eventually I managed to locate 5 of the 7 giants who had emerged from the tunnels of Castellax. 2 had died in subsequent battles, their luck finally running out in conflicts whose details were classified beyond my clearance level. But the others were alive, scattered across different regiments and serving in roles that made use of their specialized skills. I arranged for their temporary reassignment to Terra, officially for medical evaluation and psychological assessment, but actually to give them something they'd never received in their years of Imperial service: recognition that their humanity mattered. The reunion took place in a medical facility deep beneath the Himalayan mountains in chambers that had been carved from living rock during the earliest days of imperial expansion. It was fitting somehow that these giants who remembered crystal caves and underground rivers should meet in spaces that echoed the depths of their homeworlds. They were older now, their massive frames bearing new scars from battles I'd never know about. Their eyes held the weight of losses that went beyond the friends I'd known, casualties accumulated during the months we'd been apart. But they were still the same giants I remembered, still carrying crystals from homes they'd never see again, still telling stories that preserved the memory of brothers who'd fallen in service to the Emperor. "Bone Mender," said Grox 14, settling his massive frame onto a chair that had been specially reinforced for his weight. "Didn't expect to see you again. Figured you'd moved on to bigger things than patching up expendable auxiliaries." "Actually," I replied, "studying you is the bigger thing I've moved on to." I explained the research project, the authority I'd been given to document human psychology and develop new treatment protocols. More importantly, I explained what I hoped to accomplish through their participation. "The Imperium classifies you as semi-intelligent weapons," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "But I've seen the truth. You're people who've been forced into the role of weapons by circumstances beyond your control. That distinction matters, and I want to make sure it becomes part of official doctrine." The giants exchanged glances, communicating in the subtle ways that Ograns had developed to work around their verbal limitations. Finally, Grox 14 spoke for all of them. "What would that mean, practically speaking? Would it change how we're treated? Would it get us better quarters or more respect from the officers?" "I don't know," I admitted. "The Imperial military changes slowly, and there are a lot of interests invested in keeping things the way they are. But it would mean that your stories get told officially, that your sacrifices get recorded in ways that go beyond casualty statistics, that future generations of Ograns might serve with more dignity than you've been shown." Another exchange of glances, another moment of silent communication. Then Grox 14 nodded. "Then we'll help with your research, Bone Mender. Not because we expect it to change anything for us. We're too old and too broken for that to matter much. But maybe it'll make things better for the young ones coming up behind us." The research project lasted 3 years and produced over 10,000 pages of documentation about Augran psychology, social structure, and emotional needs. I interviewed dozens of survivors from different units, recorded their oral histories, and analyzed their behavioral patterns using methods that had never been applied to human subjects. The findings were revolutionary. Ograns possessed complex emotional lives that included sophisticated concepts of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. They formed social bonds that were as strong as any found in human populations, and they grieved for their losses with an intensity that put lie to assumptions about their emotional limitations. More importantly, they possessed something that Imperial doctrine claimed they lacked: individual identity. Each Augran had unique personality traits, personal preferences, and individual ways of understanding and responding to their circumstances. They weren't just big humans or simple-minded brutes. They were a distinct branch of humanity that had developed its own cultural traditions, its own methods of preserving history, and its own ways of finding meaning in circumstances that offered precious little hope. The research showed that their military effectiveness could be enhanced through recognition of their emotional needs. Units that were allowed to maintain their memorial traditions showed better combat performance and lower rates of psychological breakdown. Ograns who received individual recognition for their contributions demonstrated increased initiative and tactical creativity. Most controversially, the research suggested that Ograns possessed the capacity for independent moral reasoning. They made conscious choices about when and how to follow orders based on ethical considerations that went beyond simple obedience or fear of punishment. The implications were staggering. If Ograns could make moral choices, then they were responsible for their actions in ways that the current classification system didn't recognize. More importantly, the Imperium was responsible for how it treated beings capable of such reasoning. The final report was submitted to the highest levels of Imperial military command, where it promptly disappeared into the bureaucratic maze that governed policy decisions affecting trillions of human lives. Months passed without any official response. I began to suspect that my findings were too challenging to existing doctrine to receive serious consideration. The Imperial military had functioned for millennia based on clear distinctions between human personnel and abhuman auxiliaries. Acknowledging that those distinctions were artificial would require fundamental changes to training, doctrine, and resource allocation. Then, unexpectedly, I received a summons to appear before a tribunal of senior officers whose authority extended across multiple sectors of Imperial space. The hearing took place in a chamber deep within the Adeptus Terra complex, where decisions were made that affected the course of galactic civilization. I'd never been in such rarefied company. These were men and women whose casual orders could determine the fate of entire star systems. "Medici Thane," said the tribunal's chairman, a Lord General whose augmetic eye gleamed with cold intelligence. "You've submitted a report that makes extraordinary claims about abhuman psychology and capability. These claims, if accepted, would require significant changes to current military doctrine." "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. "The evidence supports those claims." "Evidence," repeated another tribunal member, a woman whose scarred face spoke of battles fought on distant worlds. "You've interviewed how many subjects? 50? 100? Do you consider that sufficient to justify sweeping conclusions about millions of abhuman auxiliaries?" "The sample size was limited by the availability of subjects," I admitted, "but the findings were consistent across all units studied. The psychological patterns I documented appear to be universal among Augran populations." The questions continued for hours, covering every aspect of my methodology and findings. The tribunal members were thorough and skeptical, probing for weaknesses in my arguments and alternatives to my conclusions. But gradually I began to sense that their skepticism was professional rather than ideological. They weren't rejecting my findings out of hand. They were testing them to determine whether they could withstand the kind of scrutiny that major policy changes would inevitably attract. Finally, the Lord General called for a recess, and the tribunal members withdrew to consider their decision. I waited in the antechamber, surrounded by guards whose augmetic enhancements marked them as elite Tempestus scions. When the tribunal reconvened, their verdict was both surprising and disappointing. "Medici Thane," the Lord General announced, "this tribunal finds that your research meets acceptable standards of scientific rigor and that your conclusions are supported by the available evidence. However, implementation of policy changes based on these findings would require resources and administrative effort that exceed current priorities." He paused, consulting a data slate that glowed with classified markings. "Therefore, this tribunal orders that your research be classified and archived pending future review. You are commended for your dedication to Imperial service and reassigned to medical duties that will make better use of your specialized knowledge." The dismissal was polite but final. My research would disappear into the vast archives of Imperial bureaucracy, where it would gather dust alongside thousands of other studies that had challenged existing doctrine. The Ograns would continue to serve as expendable auxiliaries, their humanity unrecognized by the system that used their lives as currency in the endless war for survival. But the tribunal's decision came with an unexpected element. My new assignment was to the Departamento Munitorum's Medical Policy Division, where I would be responsible for developing treatment protocols for special populations within the Imperial military. It was a position that offered significant influence over how abhuman personnel were cared for, even if their basic classification remained unchanged. More importantly, it was a position that would allow me to continue documenting Ogryn psychology and advocating for improved conditions, albeit through channels that were less visible than official policy changes. The work began immediately. I was given authority to establish medical standards for abhuman auxiliaries across multiple sectors with particular focus on psychological support and unit cohesion protocols. Working within the constraints of existing doctrine, I developed guidelines that recognized Ogryn emotional needs without explicitly challenging their classification as military equipment. Memorial services became morale maintenance activities. Individual recognition became performance optimization protocols. Group counseling became unit efficiency enhancement procedures. The changes were subtle and bureaucratic, hidden within technical language that wouldn't attract attention from those who preferred the status quo. But they were real changes that would affect how hundreds of thousands of Ogryns were treated throughout the Imperial military. Most importantly, the new protocols required that medical personnel receive training in abhuman psychology, including education about the complex inner lives of soldiers who had previously been dismissed as simple-minded tools. It wasn't the revolutionary reform I'd hoped for, but it was progress. Incremental, bureaucratic, hidden within the vast machinery of Imperial administration, but real nonetheless. The implementation took years, rolling out across the galaxy through channels that moved with the glacial pace of institutional change. I monitored the results through medical reports and casualty statistics, looking for signs that the new protocols were making a difference in the lives of the giants I'd come to respect. The evidence was mixed but encouraging. Units that implemented the memorial service protocol showed improved combat effectiveness and lower rates of behavioral problems. Ogryns who received individual recognition demonstrated increased initiative and tactical creativity. Most importantly, medical personnel who worked with Ogryn units began reporting observations that aligned with my research findings. They noted the complex emotional lives of their patients, the strong social bonds that held units together, and the individual personalities that distinguished one Ogryn from another. The giants were being seen as people, even if they weren't officially recognized as such. But the real validation of my work came through unexpected channels. 3 years after the implementation of the new protocols, I received a message that had been routed through multiple bureaucratic layers to reach my desk. It was brief, written in the simple language that characterized Ogryn communication, and it carried no official authentication codes. "Bone Mender," the message read, "heard about the new rules. Units allowed to hold services now. Officers required to learn about us, things still hard but better than before. Thank you for seeing us as more than weapons. Grox 14. The message had no return address and no indication of how it had reached me through the labyrinthine Imperial communications network, but it was proof that the changes I'd fought for were making a difference in the lives of the soldiers I'd sworn to serve. That message sits on my desk now 20 years after I first met the giants of the 127th Cadian Heavy Infantry. It reminds me daily that progress is possible, even within systems that seem designed to resist change. The Imperium still classifies Ogryns as abhuman auxiliaries. They're still deployed in the most dangerous situations, still expected to absorb casualties that would devastate human units, still treated as expendable resources in the vast calculations that drive galactic war. But they're also recognized in small but important ways as beings worthy of dignity and respect. Their memorial services are officially sanctioned. Their individual contributions are documented. Their emotional needs are considered part of their medical care. It's not enough. It will never be enough to address the fundamental injustice of their situation, but it's something. A recognition that the line between human and weapon isn't as clear as imperial doctrine pretends, and that those who serve the Emperor deserve to be seen as more than the tools they're forced to become. The crystals from their homeworld still catch the light in medical bays across the galaxy, telling stories of giants who remember beauty and wonder despite serving in a universe that offers them precious little of either. Those stories matter, even if they're never recorded in official histories, because in the end, the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with memories, with dignity maintained in impossible circumstances, with the simple insistence that every life has value that goes beyond its utility to the war machine. The Ogrins taught me that truth. In return, I've spent my career trying to ensure that their lessons aren't forgotten, that their sacrifices are honored, and that future generations of giants might serve with more recognition of their humanity than their predecessors received. It's not much measured against the cosmic scale of their suffering, but it's something. And sometimes in a galaxy as dark as ours, something is enough to justify the struggle to make it better. The stars turn, the war continues, and somewhere in the depths of Imperial transport vessels, giants gather in circles to tell stories that preserve the memory of homes they'll never see again. Their crystals catch the light, their voices rise in hymns of remembrance, and for a few precious moments, they're more than weapons. They're the guardians of wonder in a universe that would forget what wonder means. And that makes all the difference.